So it looks like we have critical mass that's here right now. So welcome, good evening, everyone. My name is Linda Sarsour, and I am going to be your moderator this evening for this very important event. I am the co-founder of Until Freedom. Many of you know me from the streets of New York City. I've been doing criminal justice reform. Just bring me in a space to stand up against cops. You know, I just make a lot of good trouble in New York City. That's what I do for a living. And I'm very, very happy and honored to be here to actually have a very important conversation that, believe it or not, has been quite complicated for me as someone who has been doing criminal justice reform, especially in light of some of the conversations we've recently heard and are listening to through the media, through elected officials, through folks who claim to speak on behalf of victims of crime. And today, we're going to have that courageous conversation and really get to the essence of the goals of this event tonight. It's really to educate folks about how the criminal justice system works and how it too fails to protect and center those who are the survivors of harm. And we are fortunate to have experts and also directly impacted people here today. And so I'm not going to read everybody's bio because their bios are long and they are good. They are incredible human beings who have been on the front lines doing this very important work. So we have with us Alexandra Bailey, who works on state and local, who supports state and local advocates working to challenge the nation's life sentencing laws. They are going to be here representing RAP, who works with aging folks in our incarceration system, and also with the Center for Community Alternatives. We also have Mr. Darnell Epps, who is going to be here today speaking to us for the Center for Community Alternatives as well, who has been working and has been engaged on important work on criminal justice reform after his own experience with the prison system. And these are some of the most inspiring stories for me, people who are the most directly impacted, who come and be part of the work, part of the solution, because I believe that those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. He's worked as a research assistant for the Cornell Center for the Study of the Death Penalty Worldwide, bridging gaps in research and advocacy around the death penalty, and really excited. He's also from the Brooklyn, so that's, I get a little, this just speaks to my heart as a Brooklynite. We also have our dear, we have a Luz Marquez-Benbow, who is a Just Beginnings Collaborative Fellow, a Black Boricua survivor of child sex abuse, and is the founder of #IMNEGRX, make sure we're spelling that correctly, and who's going to be speaking to us around Elder Parole and Fair and Timely Parole, also coming to us for RAP, which is one of my favorite organizations doing really incredible work. We also have with us Orisa Napper-Williams, who's going to speak to us today around the fair access to victim compensation, a survivor. She is the executive director and visionary of Not Another Child, an advocacy organization which is continuing to impact communities of color to combat gun violence and support grieving families. And we know this as New Yorkers, and really in every corner of this country, there is an epidemic of gun violence, and we're losing a lot of our young people, a lot of our elders, and just people in our community. So I think it's important that we're able to have this conversation as well. We also have with us Danielle Sered, who's going to be also speaking to us around the fair access to victim compensation and drivers of violence and other subject matters, because they are experts. And I'm very happy and honored actually to be on the same platform as Danielle, who will be also speaking to us on behalf of Common Justice. And of course, you will learn much more about them through the conversation. I just wanted to make sure we kind of understood who was here, but save time to really get into the conversation that we're going to have tonight. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to start with you, Danielle. Let's just cut to the chase. What do people get wrong when they're talking about violence?
So thank you so much. Thank you to everybody joining us on the panel and for this conversation tonight. Thank you, Linda, for holding this container for us. It's a real honor to be with all of you. So I think we get almost everything wrong when we talk about violence, but I think two of the core things to anchor our conversation today is, first, we get wrong the notion that punishment is an effective or sufficient response to violence, that it reduces violence, that it heals violence, that it prevents violence. when all of those things are actually fundamentally disproven in everybody's lived experience and in all of the psychological and sociological literature you can ever find. We know the core drivers of violence are structural. They are poverty, they are inequity, they are systematic divestment in communities. And we know even on the individual level, the core drivers of violence are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. And the core features of prison are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. So we've baked into our core responses exactly the things that generate them, which connects to the second big mistake we make, which are the group of people who know that, and that's crime survivors. We have long been sold a myth that law enforcement and crime survivors are a single constituency. The police and prosecutors are the legitimate and rightful spokespeople for survivors, when in fact, police and prosecutors don't work for survivors. They will be the first people to tell you that if pressed to do so. And in fact, so often the interests of the criminal legal system and the interests of crime survivors are not just aligned, they're diametrically opposed. The same system that produces endless inequities for Black and brown people who go through it as defendants does not suddenly become anti-racist when it turns to look at the survivors who move through its doors. So survivors are met with disbelief, they are met with blame, they are met with violence, they are met with doubt, they are met with inadequate resources, the wrong resources, insufficient resources, silent punishment, all of those things themselves. And what we know is that when we ask survivors what they actually want, survivors speak of an affirmative vision of safety. There are two things as survivors we can't stand. We can't stand the idea of going through it again, and we can't stand the idea of someone else going through what we went through. And the hardest people to persuade that prison will prevent those things we cannot stand are any of us who have lived in communities where incarceration is common. We have paid the price for prison's failure with our enduring pain, and we know better than that. And so it's our belief at Common Justice that that the correction of these two myths go hand in hand, and that survivors will always be the people who know most about where those solutions to violence lie.
That's right. And just to color that just a little bit for us, Danielle, can you give us examples of how the criminal justice system fails survivors?
So survivors often seek solutions other than punishment. If survivors express to a prosecutor that they'd like to see the person change, they'd like to see the person get help, but they're uninterested in punishment, very often survivors are pathologized when they do that. They're sort of treated as though they have been tricked in some way to care about the interest of the person who hurt them, that they're not smart enough to have escaped that manipulation, or that their interests don't matter when they're weighed against other interests that are often unnamed, right? So one way is the way in which survivors are discarded in that way. The other is that for the handful of survivors who actually make it to a trial process or show up in court, those processes are grueling, they're re-traumatizing, people are disbelieved, they're shamed, they're doubted, they're questioned about the hardest experiences in their lives in rooms that are built to disprove what they know to be as their reality. And that harm can disrupt any healing that has happened for them and can last throughout their lifetimes, through generations. And the criminal legal system also creates, and we'll get to this when we talk about the Fair Access to Victims Compensation Campaign, it conflates one's right to healing with one's participation in the criminal legal system. So the resources that we structurally make available for survivors, we withhold only for those survivors who decide to participate in calling the police and assisting in prosecution. It's not actually our belief that by virtue of being hurt, you become obligated to serve as like a volunteer arm of the criminal legal system, right? We believe that as survivors, we are inherently entitled to healing, every single one of us. We are inherently entitled to repair. We are inherently entitled to safety, and that our entitlement to that is not contingent on whether or not we find safety and protection and fairness in the criminal legal system. So as we talk about the Fair Access to Victims Compensation Campaign through tonight, I think it points to one of the most central places that we as a society have made a decision to stand between survivors and their healing by centering punishment over what survivors tell us they need.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And for folks who are with us here today, please check the chat if you are in need of interpretation services. There are instructions there to ensure that you're getting the right interpretation channel for your particular language. We want to make sure that this information is accessible to everyone and that you are all able to participate not only in getting the information, but later on as we ask you to join us and be part of the campaigns that you will hear more about today. So now I want to go to you, Luz. People often try to pit the interests of survivors in opposition to reform of the criminal justice system. Will you talk about how those actually go hand in hand, that they're not actually contradictory?
Sure. And I want to say one thing before I respond to you is, if you haven't already realized, we're going to talk about some critically traumatic experiences, as I am a survivor and there are others on here. And if you have not centered yourself around a way to take care of yourself in the next 2 hours, I encourage you to please do that, whether it's incest, agua florida, or just some water, some way to kind of maintain yourself in the room. Because while I think that this is a critically important conversation, your safety and your sense of well-being is much more important. With that said, in order for me to answer your question, I have to bring Lulu into the space. Much like I am an adult survivor of child sexual abuse, so was Lulu. Lulu happened to be the first Black woman to die from COVID during the first stage of COVID. Like me, Lulu was an adult survivor of child sexual abuse and also experienced the trauma of losing her parents as a child. Many people like Lulu, like me, are behind bars. I have been part of the mainstream movement to end violence against women in this country for the last 20 years, and shamefully on us, we always pitted survivors against other survivors. And because we live in a white supremacist and patriarchal world, our movements are also examples of how racism looks and how patriarchy looks. And so many of us in the violence against women movement pit crimes against crimes. So if you're a victim of rape and you show up at an ER, there's a process by which a victim advocate will meet you. They'll connect you to services. They'll even file crime victims compensation for you. In the state of New York, luckily, we did away with the fact that in order to get compensation, you had to report to police, right? We got rid of that. That's not the same process if you're a gun victim survivor. If you're a gun victim survivor, the hospital shuts down. Your family can't even get in there to see you. And the person that you are resolved to be near and only around is police. And this is problematic because victims of gun violence deserve the same rights that victims like me deserve and get. And there's millions of dollars that come into the New York for crime victims. And yet crime victims are not providing those services. Who is our Black colleagues who both have experienced trauma firsthand and are providing that. I happen to live in the capital region. By the way, Linda Rosa sends her love and thank you. But up in our case, we only have one program that provides that service. And they show up both for the person who was harmed and the person who did the harm doing. Understanding that there's an intersection between those. For years, we've been talking about violence against women. There's a huge distance between the person who commits the harm and the person who receives it. I'm here to tell you that everybody who abused me between the ages of 7 till I was 15 was a family person and someone in my family. They were not strangers. And that this is unfortunately the high numbers of what violence looks like, and that there's a deep connection between us, whether it's family or in your community. And we could address this. We could address this by looking and supporting like logical legislation like fair and timely parole and elder parole, which really get at the fact that the criminal justice system is racist as hell, and they have slept on their processes that they were supposed to have in place for people who have done their time or even improving their lives while they're in there and deserve a chance to rebuild and to come out here and work with us to end such violence. And so hopefully I answered your question, but I'm going to end there.
Thank you so much, Luz. And I appreciate you bringing up the point about folks really taking care of themselves, because we do have a few panelists who are directly impacted people who are people who have experienced extreme trauma, and some continue to do so at the hands of the system. So thank you for saying that, Luz. So if anyone feels any moment of discomfort or anything, please feel free to get up away from your Zoom. Feel free to mute us if you have to. Because we know that these are some very difficult conversations that we are having. And that brings me to Alex. And Alex, again, I'd like to bring you here to the platform to talk to us as a survivor. You know, what draws you to research and decarceration work at the Sentencing Project?
Thank you so much for having me. And Luis, thank you so much for sharing your story, and for everyone here who is hearing themselves in this story, in these stories, because it is a shared story. And I'm so glad that we're coming together to take back this narrative that has been co-opted by a racist system designed to drive incarceration. My family is all originally from Louisiana, from Tunica, which is just beyond Angola prison, which is a former plantation that still serves as a plantation 2.0. We don't have to really go too far to see that this system has massive inequities when it comes to race, when it comes to gender. The rate of women who are incarcerated has jumped by 400% since 1980, right? But the first recipient of the Domestic Violence Survivor Justice Act was a young Black man who is an incredible human being, an active Quaker who begged for help his entire childhood and ultimately had to take it into its hands. And I was sitting before the New York State Legislature just a couple of weeks ago on the bills that we're talking about, fair and timely parole and elder parole. And I was literally having an argument with a white man who was a former prosecutor to say to him, you know, I'm a survivor of childhood incestuous rape, right? One of the unforgivable crimes that you've identified. But do you want to know the reason I didn't fight back as a grown woman in a DV situation? Because I knew that criminalization was just the other side of that coin. And this is the thing that the system that is so insistent that it is on our side does not understand. And as we work around the country, I'm in Louisiana right now, I'm working a bill for domestic violence survivors in Oklahoma, women who've been drugged down to their basement, handcuffed, assaulted for hours, managed to wrestle a gun, save their own lives, or serving life sentences. And we're not talking about how, if you defend yourself, because the system has no intention of defending you, because you're not a perfect victim, because you come from the wrong community, because you practice a certain religion, whatever the case might be, that they actually have nothing for you but criminalization. And it's driving our carceral numbers. The United States is an embarrassment worldwide. We incarcerate more people than any nation on earth. That includes China. The rate of Black and brown people represented in that system are insane. And when you spend your whole childhood watching your family try to get your loved one off death row, when you're the survivor of that person, and you stand up and say, I would testify for their parole tomorrow. You know what the system could have done for me, Linda? When he was sexually assaulted, if we had had a world where he, as a young Black boy, had somewhere to go and someone to talk to, I might not be here being a survivor. I might just be sharing the stats, but we didn't do that. And so here we are. And I'm hoping that if I ever have a child, that they live in that world and not this one.
Alex, I want to live in a world where you're the one that's telling us how to, you know, fix everything that is broken. And I just want to say that your courage and just you telling your story, but also, again, finding ways to take that trauma, to take those experiences and then bring them into this work of justice for others is just incredibly inspiring. So just thank you so much for being here today. And I'm going to come back to you in a second. I want to ask the same of Darnell. And I thank you, Darnell, for being here with us today. And, there is a stigma for people convicted of violence as being irredeemable. These are people who immediately our society discards based on whatever act of violence they were engaged in. And how do we push back on that? How do we get people to a different place when it comes to these crimes of violence? Like, where are the second chances and the third chances? Where is there a place for restorative justice for people who commit acts of violence? And I think those are usually the conversations people want to have. They'll list all the crimes that we should never forgive people for, without even trying to put people in context or circumstances or look at their history or look at how anything. It's just they committed a crime, they are discarded. So how do we change that conversation?
Good question. From my experience, it's often the case that many people who share that view have never themselves interacted with a person who's serving a long-term sentence for a so-called violent offense. And they probably haven't looked at the data either. Several studies, including a recent one by the US Sentencing Commission, have shown that people serving lengthy prison sentences, 10 years or more in prison, are 30% less likely to recidivate. Nearly 60% of the people serving long sentences in this country are incarcerated for violent offenses. Anecdotally, I can say that, I spent 17 years in prison serving an indeterminate life sentence. I had no criminal record prior to entering the penitentiary in New York. I was 20 years old, convicted of a crime of gun violence in the housing projects where I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I dropped out of school in the 10th grade before, going to prison. And I took my first college class inside a maximum security prison. Today, after graduating from Cornell University, I'm now, my dream of attending law school, I'm living that out. I'm a 2L student at Yale. I'm a leader for the Center for Community Alternatives. And, we're campaigning for sentencing reform based on some of these very issues. But I can say that, the most inspiring people to me and the most learned people that I met during the course of my time inside New York's correctional system were people who were serving long sentences for violent crimes. I challenge any lawmaker to walk inside a maximum security prison and sit and observe any of the most impactful programming going on inside that facility. Often you'll see lifers or old timers running the anger management courses, overseeing substance abuse sessions, facilitating programming in the educational building, or volunteering as a teacher's assistant in a college program. Even doing things like counseling at-risk youth through the prison's youth assistance program. A lot of those roles reflect the transformative experiences that go on inside the prison system. When I entered the system at the age of 20, I was not the person I was when I left at the age of 37. No one is irredeemable. We have to look at someone's experiences inside the correctional system and recognize that these are human beings. Some people make very poor decisions. 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds that I've met inside New York's prison system who were serving sentences that were essentially life without parole, 80 years, 100 years, who will never get the opportunity to see their family again, who are witnessing loved ones die as they get older in the correctional system. It's a bone-crushing experience for anyone. And to remove hope from people, I think, is inhumane. And I think our sentencing laws and our sentencing schemes need to reflect where we are as a society today. Right now in New York's prison system, many people are serving sentences based on a sentencing regime from the 1990s. We're not where we were today as a society. We're more open-minded and realize the errors of the past that led to mass incarceration, but yet we're still sentencing people based on laws that existed at a time when, the Prison Litigation Reform Act was passed. The crime bill was passed. We thought we could police ourselves out of this, out of crime, which is proven to be a fallacy. I think, we need to learn from our mistakes. And, I'm hopeful that, our campaign is going to result in meaningful change and that people will be given a second chance. I'm a father, 2 children, I have a son and a daughter, homeowner, I work, I go to school. I try my best to uplift people who are going through problems that I went through when I was growing up. But I think we have to look at people as humans and recognize their capacity for change. And, I hope my experiences and what I do helps change or debunk some of the myths about people who serve time for violent offenses. Could have easily been the other way, and I could still be in prison today serving a life sentence without a family, without any opportunity to contribute positively to my community. So with that, I'll end that.
I appreciate that, Darnell. And I think what's incredible and important is that you are here today and you are talking to people today and people are listening to you today. I've been in the past, over the last 2 decades, I've been criticized many times for organizing with formerly incarcerated folks, some folks who have committed acts of violence, but people who came out and said, I'm going to go back to the projects. I'm going to go back to the Bronx, right? I'm going to go back to the young people in my community, say, don't be me. It's not gangster to be a shooter. It's not, drug dealing is not the way to go. And guess what? Those young people are going to listen to them and listen to people like my son, the general, who also spent 7 years in prison for a crime he didn't even commit. And they will listen to my son and listen to other formerly incarcerated people before they would ever listen to me. So people understanding the important role that folks who are formerly incarcerated, folks who've been in the system bring to the table, right? Those are the people that are going to transform our communities, right? Those are going to be the people that show us and show our young people a different way. Like some of us could do the work, we could be experts in an area, but we don't got the life experience. So it's just not going to work. So congratulations. I'm just sitting here like in awe, like I'm usually got a lot of things to say, but thank you, Darnell. I'm inspired by just everybody, incredible people that are here today. Next, I want to bring in someone else who is a survivor as well. And listen, we just came off the last week or last 2 weeks, I don't know, 3 weeks. Every week is violence in America. I can't even keep up with America's violence. It's such an exhausting place to be. And so as we sit here today having this important conversation, our condolences to the family of Tyree Nichols, the family of Keenan Anderson, the families in Monterey Park, and the families in Half Moon Bay, and the families in Chicago and Baltimore and New York and Memphis and everywhere where we continue to have people who are impacted by gun violence. And so I want to bring in Orisa and have her bring her voice here as a survivor and someone who lost your son to gun violence. And can you, share a bit about your experience with law enforcement and applying for victim compensation? What would have made that experience better for you?
Good evening, everyone. I'm honored to be here this evening. A lot of times I'm called on as a survivor, which I am a survivor first, but doing this work also for the last 15 years has made me more than a survivor. Voices are needed on both sides of the gun. And so last week, as I stood with my son in the Bronx and with Tamika in the Bronx, with the families, it just shows that every voice matters. And sometimes our voice is considered the voice of pain. And a lot of times our youth look at and they kind of hold more to the voice of pain a lot because all of them have mothers and aunties and grandmothers and just people that they know will feel the pain of their repercussions if anything was to happen. And so 16 years ago, it will be 16 years, August 7th, 2006, when I got the call that my son was murdered. In my PD, because my son was murdered in Brooklyn, played a very vital role in the beginning of my healing, because the way that we are informed, the way that our loved one is looked at, the way that which we are communicated with is vital to our healing. And so when I was in the hospital and I began to be interrogated rather than consoled, rather than assuring that I was okay by NYPD of, did I know what my son was doing there and what did he have on and things of that nature, which was NYPD along with the hospital doctor. Those things, they started to play a toll with me. Even as I left the hospital and was settled at my family members' houses, just getting the call from the precinct saying, yeah, I'm the detective on the case and we'll let you know if your child had anything to do with it. Had I not been surrounded with my faith-based family, myself and my natural family was surrounded with my faith-based family that was able to then shut it down and take the calls and protect me, I think that my road would have been very tumultuous. And even as it went along, I was given one direct place to go to for support, and that place was an agency that is funded by the city as well. And as much as I love it, as much as in my current work, I work side by side with them, it was still a feeling of coldness. It was still a feeling of being a number. It was still a feeling of, this is the paperwork that you have to fill out. If you need any other support or counseling, we're here, and so all of those things played a toll. The crime victims compensation application is one of the most racist documents that I have ever completed. For the first line to be the victim must have been an innocent victim of a crime still concerns me. It concerns me that an NYPD detective is the one that determines if your loved one is an innocent victim of a crime. And it always takes me back to raising my sons in East Harlem and sending them to the store and wondering, where are they? It's taking them so long, and looking out the window. And, when they come upstairs, they're like, Mom, we know it took us a while. And I said, no, I'm okay. I saw you talking to the officers and I'm happy. And just to find out that the officers was asking my sons, what are your names? So that when things happen, as y'all get older, we'll know who you are. And so that comes back to my memory when detectives have to determine if you are an innocent victim of a crime. Because that means if you're 15 and got in trouble with the law and you've changed your life or whatever the instance is, and you become later on murdered, they can easily say, no, he wasn't innocent because I ran into him when he was 15, when he was 20, and so those things concern me. It concerns me that the amount of money that we have been given since 2006 was when my son was murdered was $6,000, and it still is now. Eggs is even $6, and inflation has shown a part in every portion. So it kind of determines that although your loved one may be dead and gone, you will still have to pay the price for what we consider to that they have lived some type of lifestyle that we know about or don't know about. Because someone brought up earlier the stigma even of our loved ones. They still stay with us years later. I have met so many people that I know it's been on the tip of their tongue, but it wouldn't come out because of how I would look at them of, what did my son do to be murdered? And so that stigma, when it comes to our Black and brown youth, forget about our Black and brown young men, it is there and it stays there and it continues to stay there. And so I partnered with Common Justice for this first portion of the crime victims compensation expansion, knowing that it is a lot more work to do. And just, I work with countless mothers. Tamika calls me with mothers all the time, mothers and baby mamas and spouses. And, gun violence has no boundary, so neither does the work, and a lot of them have not had the same experience that I've had. A lot of them have been given the first $3,000, but not the second $3,000 for the balance, and they don't even know how they're going to bury their loved ones. A lot of them have not received phone calls from detectives because of the detectives' thoughts about our loved ones. And so it is a lot of work to be done in both aspects, whether it is the incarcerated on one side or whether it is the survivors on the other side.
Thank you, Orisa. And, you're someone else. I mean, on the front lines, and you took tragedy and trauma and translated into power, and also being support and love for other families that have experienced what you've experienced. So may God bless you and protect you. And also may your beloved child rest in power and know that his life did not go in vain, because here you are still outside, still fighting not only for him, but for so many others. And just when I see you at the, at the press conference, I said, oh, I hear her voice. I hear her. She's outside. So we appreciate you. I'll be back with you in a second. Danielle, I want to bring you back in here because I think this is an important question as we just listened to Orisa talk about her own experiences around victim compensation. And so I know that Common Justice is leading, the push for fair access to victim compensation. And many people may have never heard of that before. To be quite honest with you, like I didn't before, this kind of engagement and this conversation. I mean, I might have heard, but I didn't really know anything about it deeply. So what is victim compensation and what needs to change for it to actually help survivors?
Thank you so much for that. I mean, I think one way to think about it is to imagine that you are a survivor who has reason to distrust that the police will protect your safety. You are a Black or brown person in America. You yourself have been hurt by police. You are LGBTQIA+. You are not a full citizen. You are on probation. You are on parole. Your loved one is on probation or parole. You are a parent who's worried ACS will be called if you call and report what's happened to you. And you see in the distance a room, you have been hurt in an instant, right? You are a victim of violence, and you see in the distance a room where so much of what you need to heal is held, right? Where there's trauma-focused therapy, there is payment for the medical bills you incurred that otherwise are this lifelong debt, like debilitating debt. There is an opportunity to change your locks or to relocate to meet your basic needs as you come through this thing from which you should have always been protected. And you walk toward that room, and at the entrance of the room is an armed cop, just like the person you knew you couldn't trust to protect you. And you have to make a choice of whether you can ask that person's permission to enter the room. That's how victims' compensation is structured in America. So victims' compensation comes from a federal fund called VOCA, which stands for the Victims of Crime Act. And it provides resources to survivors of violence to come through what happened to them. These aren't just wild financial resources. They are very particular to the needs that arise from violence, like resolving medical debt, like seeking trauma-focused therapy, like changing locks and relocation. So it's actually a very particular set of supports, but ones that can be life-changing for people who have experienced violence. And the problem is that you can only get those supports if you cooperate with law enforcement. So if you don't call the police or you decide not to participate in the prosecution, you are excluded from all of those benefits to which you are otherwise entitled. In our view, it's actually a misinterpretation of the federal statute. The federal statute requires that states promote reasonable cooperation with law enforcement. We do not believe it's reasonable to cooperate with law enforcement if you think you may be killed as a result of participating, if you think your abusive partner may escalate the violence against you or your children, if you think you may lose your children, lose your citizenship, lose your life, be disbelieved, be harmed, be re-traumatized, that it's not actually reasonable to require that. And that states promoting it. Promote means promote, not require. Like we know promote masks or require masks are not the same thing. But every single state in this country has interpreted the law in the same way to say that if you don't cooperate with police and prosecutors, that you cannot have access to these resources. And the Fair Access to Victims Compensation Act quite simply says, like, remove that bouncer from the door. And in that person's place, put a victim's advocate, right? Put a medical doctor who does a forensic rape exam and can attest to it. Put somebody who can be trustworthy to victims, who will believe them about their survivorship and treat them with care and concern, so that everyone can access these resources to which they're entitled. So the law creates a number of pathways where survivors can report what happened to them to people other than law enforcement, and in so doing become eligible for this compensation that can be so transformative in the first stages of people's healing through harm from which they should always have been protected in the first place.
I want to let Alex in here just for a quick, just the follow-up, just because it goes along. Alex, I know you wanted to contribute to this particular question.
Well, I mean, I just want to blow up their spot for a quick second, because there's this concept, right, that this is race or just income based, right? It really doesn't matter. You know, my own privilege, I am a well-educated, light-skinned Black woman who found herself in a DV situation with a white husband. And cops asking me, they were like, well, did he slam your head in the door repeatedly? I was like, was the metal towel rack that he took to my head not sufficient? And then them not even bother to fill out a police report. And as we all know, physical abuse often comes along with physical abuse. This is incredibly common. And then you actually are just trying to go to get a protection order. And the experience of trying to be perfect in that moment, to try to ask for help, like if you have any background, I remember I was going through the pro bono process because he had cut me off from all of our finances. Going through the pro bono process and speaking of racist applications, being like, do you have a criminal background? Do you have children? Basically, is your case a light lift? Mm-hmm. And who is a light lift? People with privilege. And so I'm sitting in this fancy law firm, right? Have all of these lawyers, you know, come to help me out. And I'm sitting there listening to the cases before and after me. And I'm thinking, man, this is absolutely ridiculous. And they're begging for prosecutors to help them. And the prosecutors are saying no. But they said no to me too, because I was married to a wealthy white man. This system is not for survivors, period. And the unfortunate thing is most people don't learn that until they come in contact with it. And I just really wish we could get off of this false narrative. This system doesn't work. It needs to be put in the trash.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Alex, for coming in with that. I want to bring Darnell back here in the space because there was a question from a brother named Patrick that really moved me. Patrick shared an experience about being a formerly incarcerated person himself, and actually was able to have a dialogue with the brother of someone that he actually, was the victim of his crime. I want to say it that way. And felt that was a powerful, this idea of restorative justice. Where does the dialogue come in? And is that something we could bring to New York State? Is that something that already happens? Do you feel that there's power in that, especially as we talk about transformation and the transformative journey that people take who have been either perpetrators of violence and those, of course, survivors on the other end?
Yeah, that's a great question, Patrick. There's something incredibly powerful about that, having that restorative experience, with someone you've harmed, or a family member of someone you harmed. I don't think there's much opportunity for that in the current system. I think, often it's just a victim impact statement at sentencing, but there's no dialogue between the person incarcerated and the victim or the victim's family once they're inside. How we facilitate that, would probably be through legislation. of a kind, maybe through the clemency process. But again, it's not something that's really made a priority. At least when I was in a correction system, when I was in prison, it wasn't something that was easily achievable. I know many people inside who've committed, violent crimes are very sorry for what they did, and have tremendous regret and guilt about that, and would appreciate an opportunity to communicate that to the people they've harmed. And I don't think right now there's a system in New York, at least, that really allows for that to happen. There needs to be a space for that. And, that's something that should be considered, perhaps through the clemency process or through some other legislation.
Thank you, Darnell. I appreciate that. I'm trying to mix up the conversation, making sure that folks in the question and answer part feel heard. And I'm gonna go to you, Luz, on this one. We have a sister here, Sharon, was talking about the idea that even the compensation is limited, in the sense that, look, people are experiencing trauma. They need mental health services. This is not something you get over just in like a month or 6 months or even 6 years, or I'm sure Orisa will tell us 15 years or whatever the time is since you lose your loved one, or either lose your loved one to violence, or you lose them, to the prison system because of that. Both ways people are losing the ones that they love. And we know that you've been a critic of survivor advocacy groups. That's why I liked you. That's why you and you friends with my sis Rosa, because you be speaking truth to power. And so just knowing that the way in which the system works, and those who claim to support the survivors are also there. The critiques need to come out, because if we don't critique, right, we're not able to understand what needs to be changed. So if you could share with us a bit of those critiques, and how we can move forward.
Sure. And I got to tell you, I haven't been a Justice Beginnings Collaborative Fellow in like 3 years, but I love that people still see me that way. But I am a crime victim advocate. I've been a crime victim advocate since 1997 here in New York State and nationally. And so I feel like I could criticize them, even though other people should as well, because there's been a lot of great movements that we have made as a crime victim movement, primarily as it pertains to violence against women, because that's my lane. That's what I'm a survivor of, and that's my lane. That's where I sit. But also we have played into the racist and the patriarchal process. So when I hear people say you have to work with the criminal justice system in order to get victim crime compensation, that's not true for rape and sexual assaults. We fought for that. I fought for that in the early 2000s when we at the Coalition Against Sexual Assault, we formed that. And we were the first state in the country to get crime victims compensation, as well as to pay for the forensic sexual assault response, the forensic exam, which we all know as the rape kit, without having to force survivors to talk to law enforcement, because we understood that in order to do that meant that a person who's a victim of domestic violence, sexual assault could be jeopardizing their own livelihood, right? And then I can't do the work that I do without going all the way back to Insight, The Color of Violence, that really was formed by a whole ton of us, women of color from across the country, some of the best thinkers, Angela Davis, Andrea Ritchie, who are also survivors, and saying we need transformative justice processes, because if we're about ending any form of violence at the root cause, then it's not the criminal justice system, right? And it is not in compensating survivors at their worst moment and most intimate and vulnerable moment that says, I'm gonna give you money to help you pay for the funeral or help you rebuild your life after a rape, only if you help me, right? Incarcerate. And half of the time, and for us as Black survivors, as people of color survivors, as survivors at so many intersections with your undocumented, trans survivors, LGBT survivors, for many of us, we're being abused and harmed by the very people in our community. And we don't want them to end up like Tyree Nichols, or in my neck of the woods in Troy, New York, like Edson Thevenin, right? We don't want the police department to kill innocent people like they killed Edson Thevenin in my Troy, New York in 2016. That doesn't make any sense, right? And so many times we're forcing communities of color and folks at intersections to choose between their safety and the safety of their children, right? Or between their safety and the safety of their community. And we're forcing them to be traitors. And for many of us, I had to leave Harlem. I'm a Harlem girl, dead to die for. But the reason I live in Troy, New York is because I didn't go through the system. I knew I needed to heal. I flunked out of college. I don't have a degree, but I needed to be somewhere safe. And so I came here, I rebuilt my life, and here I am. And I know that I'm not the only one. So I share that to say is people are dying in prison. And many of us in New York do not agree with the death penalty. And what we're missing is that if we don't do and support fair and timely and elder parole, like Lulu, people are going to continue to die. Columbia University did a study that over the last 10 years, a total number of people executed are more than that found that more people who have died in our state prisons in just 10 years than the total amount of people executed during more than 350 years of New York, right? And so that don't make no sense, you all. That makes no sense whatsoever. And holding on to those people is not going to end and get to the root cause. Having conversations with them is, and I'm going to end with Anhisma is a South Asian program out in California, also a survivor, was also a Just Beginnings collaborative. She went and took a handful of us survivors and we circled with sex offenders, not our direct sex offenders, but sex offenders. And we began to talk about the healing, and we had more in common than we had differences. But we, for whatever reason, are taught by watching media and the TV that we will get justice in the courtroom, that we will get healing. And I'm here to tell you, I'm 56 years old and I've been healing since I've been 26. There used to be a time that I was so mad that I would always be healing. I finally get, in order for me, the best wife, the best mother I can be, the best advocate, it is my duty to heal. And this is the work that I do. So I hope that I answered your question, but people are dying in prison for no reason but because we live in a very racist and patriarchal state that talks about liberal. But if you go above the Tappan Zee to the Capital Region, out to Western Buffalo, you will see we just like the South. That's and right. it needs to end.
Someone get this woman a pulpit, please.
Thank you, Luce. I really appreciate that. And, just to say here, and I'll say this here, I don't want the cop to kill guilty people. That don't kill innocent ones and don't kill the guilty ones. Everybody deserves their day.
Absolutely.
And everybody deserves due process. I want to make sure that we're giving everyone a space to kind of wrap this conversation up. So I want folks to be brief, but I also want you to speak just a little bit slower, just to make sure that our interpreters are able to follow. Because us New Yorkers, I'm struggling over here too. Us New Yorkers, the Brooklyn, Harlem folks, like, it's got to slow it down.
New Yorican thing.
Yeah, New Yorican thing. Oh, I know. I'm going to bring Darnell in here for a second because I want people to make sure that they do not leave here today without hearing quickly about the Second Look Act, right? So we talked about the Fair Compensation Act right now, and I want people to learn just a little bit about the Second Look Act. So please, Darnell, talk about the Communities Not Cages campaign and the Second Look Act.
Yeah, so there's two pieces of legislation that we're putting forward. One is to eliminate mandatory minimums, which require judges to impose long prison sentences, regardless of whether there are factors that warrant leniency in a given case, whether that be age, someone's minor involvement in the crime, or tumultuous upbringing. So that's one piece of legislation I think is very important because nationwide, 90% of all criminal convictions are obtained through guilty plea. In New York, a judge just cannot unilaterally ask or require a prosecutor to reduce a charge for purposes of disposing of the case, right? The prosecutor has to consent to a charge down. So judges are really constrained, and prosecutors often can indict a ham sandwich and charge the highest level criminal offense on the statute books, which results in unfair bargaining power when it comes to guilty pleas. So I think that's important. As far as the second look legislation, it provides an opportunity for people who are serving long-term sentences, the ones who are least likely to recidivate, to petition a judge after 10 years for a reduced sentence in light of evidence of rehabilitation. And what Patrick mentioned earlier, this proceeding could potentially be an opportunity or provide a space for that dialogue, that restorative dialogue that is so desperately needed in our system. But yeah, it also incentivizes people to devote themselves to growth on the inside. People do that anyway, right? So nobody's just going to do it because they want to get a reduced sentence. But we need to recognize change when change happens within the correction system. And second look is a fail-safe that we so desperately need. Clemency. I mean, look back in December, how many people did Governor Hochul grant clemency to? Not a whole lot. There is a committee that she instituted that's going to look into the clemency process more deeply, but we need something more direct. When I left the system, I had friends who had clemency petitions pending for probably 5 or 6 years and had never received an answer to it. So the clemency process is broken. Prosecutors have unfettered discretion to charge the highest level criminal offense. And people who don't deserve these sentences right now, if this legislation doesn't get passed, face the risk of dying in prison. I think we need to correct that. And with that, I know other people want to speak about some of their proposals, so I'll cut it short.
I appreciate that, Darnell. And at the end, I'm going to give some folks, they're going to be in the chat. So you are going to see action items, how to support these legislations in the chat. Got to call your members on the legislator. They got to hear from you. So we're going to make sure that you get access to all that information. I want to go quickly back to you, Alex, for a second. You said you were in Louisiana, as you know, or maybe you don't know, but a lot of my family is in Louisiana, and they are in Gretna and Harvey, Louisiana. That's where they live. And can you give us an example of in your work at the Sentencing Project of another state somewhere that really kind of put forth and passed some piece of legislation or some policy that you said to yourself, you know what, I wish I could take this to 50 states in America?
Well, first of all, I'm going to give a shout out to this campaign for Second Look. I was at the rally recently in New York State. I am so inspired by these advocates, and I will give New York this shout out. So I'm working in some other states in New England, and I was talking about how DC did Second Look, right? Which if you were convicted under the age of 25, you got review after 10 years, right? And then if you were over that age, now it's after 15 years. And they go, yeah, that's not progressive enough. Whose bill is best? And I said, well, that's New York State, right? So Second Look is taking off across the country. Nebraska just introduced a bill. A bill has been picked up in Michigan. Advocates in Florida are working for this. Oklahoma, Louisiana, some of the most conservative states in the union are understanding this. The system is so intensely overburdened. We're now actually getting to this narrative change. And advocates like the incredible ones in New York and across the country are forcing this country to reckon with what it has done. And one of the things that I said before the New York State legislature is like, you call this a Second Look bill. I was like, I want you to raise your hand if as a legislator, you can put your hand on your heart and say, everyone in your district got a first chance. And if you can't say that, then you need to support a bill for second chances. And I think it's slightly misnamed, but across the country, this bill is taking off. There have been a lot of conversations about nonviolent offenders, right? We've done a lot of progression on that front. Now we're actually moving to this entirely new front with Second Look. And while no state in the nation has passed as robust a Second Look bill as the Sentencing Project advocates for, we are moving that way. These bills are introduced, and now is the time for everybody on this call to get involved.
Thank you, Alex. I'm going to give, for the panel part, I'm going to give the last word to our powerful sister, Orisa. And I think for the work that you do, and especially, you know, someone who has, you know, is working directly with the folks that are the most directly impacted. You're talking to the moms and the dads and the brothers and the sisters of the people who are losing their children to mostly gun violence. And of course, we have cases of police violence as well here in New York City. If you had to tell folks, you know, what are things you can do to support these families in moments of need, you know, what do you need from us? Like, what can we do better for survivors?
Yeah, I would say to always remember to allow them to use their voice. I know a lot of organizations speak from the lens of working with survivors, but a lot of our healing comes from allowing us to be heard and allowing us to work in the space as well. So one of the things that we do is we have peer support sessions. As much as it may be, you know, warranted that we may need professional mental health services or therapeutic services of things of that nature, we need to hear from each other as well, you know, because there may be something that I can share of how I made it through a certain juncture that although it may not be the exact role for you to take. It can be a foundation from where you can start at. So we do a lot of peer support because a lot of us are Black women who have been single parents, who have raised our children by ourselves, and we're built for it. You know, but we also garner strength from each other. So I would say that that's one of the things. I'm grateful to Common Justice for this space that they allow for survivors to speak for themselves. Another thing is to make sure that your loved ones get help. You know, as a people, we always want to have the answer. And sometimes we just don't. They may need help outside of their realm. They may need to be connected to a survivor-led organization, to another parent. It's some parents that's the only conversation that I have. We're not in each other's lives any other way, but this is our bond, you know. And so I would just say to make sure that we are connected to the services that we need, to make sure that we get that peer support that we need, to make sure that we are using our voice. Sometimes when they have shooting responses, I go and I won't even talk. I'll let other parents talk. When Common Justice and they did last year in Albany, I said, nope, I don't want to talk. I have two other parents that can speak. So they say, okay, so since you're not speaking, can you at least host? I'm like, come on, y'all, let me help, you know, push them. But, you know, I appreciate it, but I was still able, and it gave them so much just to be able to talk about your loved one and for people to hear. We just need that stage and that platform. So those are two of the things. The last thing I would just want to say, and it relates to this, but not really, for the push and the nudge that we're doing for our loved ones not to be incarcerated all of their life, please make sure that they come with the support that they need, especially those that are incarcerated for violent offenses. This is a slippery slope for me. You know, having my child killed with a 15-year-old confessing to his murder, another 25-year-old that took us through a drooling trial, and another 25-year-old that actually turned federal informant. So this is kind of, you know, I believe in a lot and I believe in people, but I'm also a survivor. I'm also at that place where, and you have to understand, survivors, our children will never see tomorrow. Our children will never see another Christmas, holiday, birthday. We could go on naming it and naming it. And so sometimes if it feels like it's a struggle, it is. It is. And I truly believe, because in the inner cities, before my son was killed, I was sitting on the other side of the court with my other son's father. who has 40 years to life for 2 murders. So we've been on both sides of the gun, but nothing hurts like this side. Nothing hurts like we often try to do comparison. Nothing hurts like not ever seeing your child again, opposed to being able to go to court, go to prison, hear their voice and phone call, nothing. And so, you know, I'm trying. Us as survivors, we are trying. We know that it is no one set narrative that's going to help with this, but it's going to take all hands on deck. And so we're here for it. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Orisa. And I want to just say thank you to Center for Community Alternatives, Common Justice, RAP, Columbia University Center for Justice, of course, Darnell and Danielle and Luz and Orisa and Alex, and you all were incredible today. Folks, the action items are in the chat. People always say you want to talk about it and then I walk away, you don't tell me what to do. The people here told you what to do. We need all hands on deck. And something that Orisa said that is the most important is keep centering the voices of the most directly impacted people. Just because you read about it and you studied it doesn't mean you know about it. Just listen to the people, what they need. And they're telling us right now that the things they're going to need support on, of course, is around Communities Not Cages campaign, the Fair Access to Victim Compensation Act, and the People's Campaign for Parole Justice. And the statute of limitations, and I'll end with this because I think this is important, is that when we pass the Fair Compensation, Access to Fair Compensation Act, it takes the statute from 1 year to 3 years, because in the first year, I don't know how they expect people who lost loved ones to figure out the paperwork, the process, how to do this in that time of great trauma. So again, in order for that to happen, we need you all. This recording is also going to be posted on the website of Common Justice. So it might not be there for a few days. And I know some of the students and others were asking, because this was incredible. Like, I want to go back and watch it again because I make sure I didn't miss anything, but it will be posted. And so again, thank you to all of you for the work that you do. And like you said, Orisa, either way, there are people that are victims, right? Whether you lost your child to gun violence or whether you are the mother that lost her child to the prison system. Of course, there's no comparison, but it's still losing those that we love. And how can we be people who are transformative? And how can we be restorative? And how could we really build a society where none of this happened, where there never is another mother that has to lose her child either to gun violence or to our prison system? So thank you, everyone, for being here with us today.
Thank you, Linda.
Great job.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Incredible, incredible.